I recently did a 30-30 workout with my friend. He was struggling to get his heart rate down for me, and for me, it was a lot easier. It was taking my body 7 seconds about to lower my heart rate after the on interval. But for him, it was closer to about 42 seconds. It was only starting to get lower in the middle of the next interval. So, what was interesting for me is that after several initial intervals, I was not able to raise my heart rate. I was always going to some low value and then rising to the same range of max. For him, though, it was generally raising the whole time. The lows were higher and the higher, or he says the lows were higher, and so were the highs. So he's talking about that, you'll see through a set of 30-30s, yet it's kind of like a little stair step with your heart rate as it goes up, is what he's describing there at the end. Whereas he said that for him, he seems like he was capped. Chad, there's so much to cover with this. He asks, are the dynamics just as is? Is there any information that we can get from it? Is it trainable? He says, any comments or info about how the dynamics of heart rate influence what type of workouts are suitable for an athlete? So once again, Chad, this is a big deep dive, but we could probably cover this for genuinely like a month of episodes. So
yeah, no, I actually allotted 1 hour for this deep dive. So we got about 30 minutes left. So you guys are going to have to listen to it at 2 times speed. So for those of you who are already doing that, you're going to want to dial it down a little bit. Got a lot to cover here. And I'll be perfectly honest, I trimmed a lot of fat too. So it is a really big topic, and I'm going to try to keep it germane to his first question: are the dynamics just as is? So he's asking about the dynamics of heart rate response to exercise, but we're going to look at it through the lens of the respiratory response. Reason being is that the demand is initiated at the muscles, and the muscles drive ventilation, and the ventilation influences your heart rate and your blood pressure. So if we started with heart rate, we'd really just be looking at it as a reaction to ventilation. Ventilation is really just a reaction to what's being required at the muscle. So really, we could kind of distill this down into the idea that endurance performance is actually a matter of oxygen demand versus oxygen supply, where the demand is created at the muscle. So anytime we need to do more work, it requires more oxygen. And the supply is met via intake at the mouth, uptake at the lungs, and then eventually utilization at the muscle. So in other words, this is a combination of pulmonary respiration, the gas exchange at the lungs, and then muscle utilization. And if you delve into the science or the research, or you listen to whatever webinars, podcasts, YouTube videos, whatever, the scientific terms that will probably get used are VO2 referring to the supply and QO2 referring to the demand at the muscle. So anytime we have mismatches in this supply and demand, there will be a change. It doesn't matter to what extent. Anytime you go from baseline, which is homeostasis, to a different level of output, there will be a mismatch in the supply and demand. And the intensity determines both the extent and the severity of this mismatch. So an exercise intensity itself is going to determine then the extent of the demand for that oxygen. The higher intensity requires higher energy creation and utilization. It's that simple. It's the whole idea of ATP turnover. So it's not just ATP utilization, it's turnover. It's cyclic. We break the bonds in ATP and then we remanufacture them. We release energy and then we store energy. And this turnover continues to happen within the muscle. And this turnover of energy that drives muscle contraction can be supported either aerobically or anaerobically. But in cases where we're going from a homeostatic level up to a new work level, the aerobic system can't respond instantly. So this brings us to what's termed oxygen uptake kinetics, or perhaps more frequently, I see the use of the term Vo2 kinetics. So the uptake is really the on kinetics side of things. So when we're getting oxygen to the muscle, and then the other side of things would be the recovery side or the off kinetics. I'm going to focus on kinetics because again, I had to trim some fat, but off kinetics is really a topic for its own question. We could go pretty deep on that one too. But simply we're looking at how quickly can you match the oxygen supply to the oxygen demand? And probably more relevant to performance is why does it even matter? So VO2, or oxygen uptake, response to exercise. We're gonna talk about some fundamental concepts of this. And before I dive into this too much, I didn't cite a whole bunch of studies for this one. There are no links. Just look at Andy Jones, Dave Pohl, Mark Burnley, Dan Gordon, and probably about 10 other authors safely. Because that's where all this comes from, both over the years and over the last few days. So all of this is relative to intensity domain. And if you haven't heard these terms, this is what you're going to see in the literature. They talk about, how hard you're working is broken into basically 4 different intensity domains, beginning with moderate, progressing to heavy, then to severe, and then to extreme. And this is kind of reflected, and I only bring this up because we have talked about this pretty recently, in that it's reflected in the whole polarized model, where it's a 3-zone model, where you have that first delineation at the first lactate turn point. So the LT1 or the VT1, the first ventilatory turn point. And then the next delineation is at that second LT turn point or ventilatory turn point, or what's also referred to as your lactate threshold, your maximum lactate steady state, your critical power, your functional threshold power. All nuanced differences and all slightly different physiological goings on, but for our purposes, all basically the same thing. Then you rise above that and move towards VO2, and you start to move into those heavier, or in particular, the severe and the extreme ranges, extreme taking place when you're above VO2 max. So the point in bringing all of this up is that oxygen kinetics follow different patterns across these different exercise domains. How hard you're working, what demand is being experienced at the muscle is going to determine what happens with your oxygen kinetics, how quickly, or what happens when your oxygen delivery is changing to match that supply or demand. So put it another way, the difference in O2 uptake responses, they're different across each of these intensities. And the biggest differentiator is basically the attainment of a steady state. So the question being, can we level off our oxygen uptake, our ventilation, our breathing rate, our heart rate, our lactate? And it turns out that when we say well below FTP, yes, that steady state is readily achievable. The closer you push to FTP, the harder it gets to achieve it, but it's still achievable. But then once you move above FTP, this is where you can no longer achieve that steady state. And that's kind of why they draw that delineation there, because above FTP, or more specifically critical power, but again, it's nuanced, you're not going to establish that steady state. Things aren't going to level off. They're going to continue to tick upwards until you reach exhaustion. So the heart of these VO2 kinetics, and in particular the on kinetics or the uptake kinetics, is this 3-phase VO2 response. So when you're in the moderate or even the heavy, so you're below FTP, it's pretty similar in that the steady state is achievable. They're slightly different, but you can still attain that leveling off. Rise above it into the severe and extreme domains. And it's quite similar too, in that steady state's off the table. Something comes into play called the VO2 slow component, and things change quite a bit. So to look at these 3 phases, and I'll try to be brief. Phase 1 is what's termed the cardiodynamic response. And this begins the minute you start to do any work, which is typically termed the onset of exercise. It's immediate, it's brief, lasts maybe 15 to 20 seconds. Your oxygen uptake increases, but your breathing doesn't. So at this point, the demand at the muscle has increased, and how much it increases, it all depends, but we can bump up the ATP requirement, the energy requirement, from homeostasis to 100-fold. So we can really jack that up there depending on how intense the activity is. When we do this, whether it's 100-fold or 10-fold, it produces CO2 as just a byproduct of energy metabolism or substrate metabolism, whatever. CO2 makes it into the bloodstream makes it to the chemoreceptors in the brain, and we get an increase in our ventilation, our breathing rate, our heart rate. So basically, this first phase is really just the time it takes for the CO2 accumulation to arrive back at the lungs. But what this means is that this is happening in the absence of increased oxygen delivery, so the energy has to be derived from anaerobic or non-oxidative resources, in particular phosphocreatine stored in the muscle.
This is like when you go up the stairs, right, Chad? Like you've been sitting at your desk and suddenly you go up the stairs. You sprint up the stairs and you're fine. Then suddenly you try to talk to somebody. You
get to the top.
Hold on.
It's exactly that.
Yeah. Cool. That's awesome. Now I know the mechanism going on. Awesome.
Okay. So now, no, that's fine. So now we move into phase 2, and this is termed a couple of things. I've seen O2 deficit phase, the primary phase, and this is where your breathing actually ramps up to meet the oxygen demand. This is also where, as the name indicates, you start to see that accumulation of oxygen debt, or more probably a better term is deficit. This is where that all kicks off. Quick sidebar, it seems almost like semantics, but the difference between debt and deficit is pretty crucial. I mean, way back in like early 1900s, when A.V. Hill first came out with this idea, he used financial terms, right? So he used the term debt, but it's not really debt. We're not like carving out a hole that oxygen is going to later refill. Rather, if there is debt, it's more of an anaerobic debt. It's a matter of how big will the hit to our anaerobic capacity be. And that's a function of the amplitude and the amplitude of change and the rate of rise to that steady state. So if we go from 100 watts to 150 watts, it's not a big amplitude. 100 watts to 400 watts or 800 watts, huge amplitude. And then how quickly does it take us to get there and then level off? This is all what's going to determine how deeply we dig into our anaerobic stores. So the faster you get there, the more you spare those anaerobic resources. The more you spare them, the more you have at hand for repeated efforts later on. Also, the less accumulation you get of those less desirable metabolites, the hydrogen ions that accompany the increase in lactate, the phosphates, all the things that can increase your blood acidity or lower your blood pH. Now, endurance training increases your aerobic capacity, and it helps us close that gap faster. So the more aerobically fit you are, the less time you are accruing that oxygen deficit, the less hit your anaerobic capacity is taking. So that's the sidebar. Back to phase 2, we have the incoming carbon dioxide that signals all the expected responses, right? Your breathing rate increases, your tidal volume increases, your cardiac output, increases. And this is where your ventilation and your work rate are quickly moving towards synchronization. And it does happen reasonably quickly. And this is the phase that reflects what's going on at the muscle bioenergetics. So initially you have that energy production or that ATP turnover, and it's covered by your PCR resources and basically anaerobically. Maybe there's some glycogen contribution in there, considering the time course, it probably is, or there is. But the longer this goes on, the greater that depletion. And even though it's temporary, you're taking a toll on those anaerobic stores. Excuse me. But effectively, while this is going on, that phosphocreatine is covering for your mitochondria. So effectively, the anaerobic system is covering for the aerobic system. Your glycolytic resources are covering for your oxidative resources. But then as the muscle oxygen uptake increases, that PCR degradation, the use of those anaerobic resources decreases. And this is about the time you start moving into phase 3. And this is where, if you're going to achieve a steady state, it's going to happen. If, however, you're working above that heavy domain, you're going to start moving into that VO2 slow component where you move inexorably toward muscle failure, or you simply bail out. So if we stay below FTP and we work in those lower exercise or output domains, intensity domains, your breathing starts to level out. This is where the supply has actually met the demand and a steady state occurs. All told, start to finish, from that inception of when you started to do more work, and this leveling out takes roughly 2 to 3 minutes. The greater your aerobic capacity, the quicker this happens. The greater your predominance of slow twitch fibers, the quicker this happens. The closer you are, that amplitude between the first ventilatory threshold, or to the first ventilatory threshold, than the second. So if you're not at a high percentage of threshold, the quicker it happens.
Can you imagine, just real quick, can you imagine if you had to think about all of this and make these decisions in real time?
Right?
Nobody would be an athlete. We'd all just lay around all day.
I can't tap my head and rub my belly at the same time. Let alone all this stuff.
Bodies are amazing.
Okay, so that's what happens below FTP. Above FTP, steady state's not on the table. You can't get there, because once you're working above your functional threshold, critical power, max last steady state, all that stuff, this slow component starts to creep into it. And this too is another area I had to trim fat. This could be an entire topic and an interesting one for a later deep dive. But the slow component is what pushes the athlete closer and closer to VO2 max. It's the very nature of that slow component. The idea being that if you work above functional threshold power, critical power, whatever, that delineation, that eventually you will reach VO2 max, even if you're just 1% above it. I contend, and a lot of people do, that you're going to run out of focus or glycogen or other things when you're working at just above FTP, but you get the idea. You work at 110% FTP, you're going to get to VO2 max in a matter of time if you can make yourself hang in there. Mm-hmm. So the demand here is still exceeding the supply. The anaerobic resources are dwindling. So again, it's going to be muscle failure or a reduction in workload. And typically athletes will veer toward the latter. The slow component also varies on a fiber type predominance based on that. So if you have more slow twitch, there's going to be a slower rise in that slow component. If you're a more aerobic or oxidatively capable athlete, higher oxidative capacity, there's going to be less reliance on that anaerobic capacity and a slower rise toward that VO2 max. But if you're a more anaerobic athlete, if you just have more fast twitch fibers, whatever, you're going to get to that slow component is going to be more rapid. You're going to reach VO2 max or failure or quit sooner. So all this brings us to, why is this a concern? Why does the kinetic rate of our oxygen uptake matter? And it comes down to the fact that we're endurance athletes. So if we were sprint athletes, this wouldn't be a big concern. But because we're endurance athletes, we need to exploit our aerobic resources to their fullest extent. We need to preserve our anaerobic resources as much as possible, and especially considering they're probably not highly developed in the first place, certainly not relative to sprint athletes. And again, slower uptake kinetics mean that the anaerobic system has to carry the aerobic system longer. The glycolytic system has to carry the oxidative system longer. So these slower kinetics mean a greater reliance on our finite anaerobic resources. So again, the rate of this oxygen response determines the extent of that oxygen deficit. And that oxygen deficit represents our anaerobic toll. So you're using finite resources again. I mean, we can reconstitute these things, but they're probably not going to happen, especially glycogen, over the course of a race. Unfortunately, and you can look at a number of authors, but Andy Jones and Mark Burnley in particular have pointed out that these kinetics are trainable. And without getting too deep in the weeds on this, or not into the weeds at all, it's really as simple as building your endurance. Foster that aerobic capacity, and you're going to increase the rate of these kinetics. Now, a couple side notes before I close this out and talk to Lucas specifically. I came across some really interesting studies, one of which they had athletes do 2 sets of trials. And in the second trial, they actually relieved a half liter of blood, which means a substantial amount of hemoglobin and oxygen carrying capacity went with it. And what did they see but the exact same VO2 response? They still reached the same level of oxygen uptake. They still did it in the same manner of time. So this might be reason for us to revisit that whole idea of how much does blood donation affect my performance capabilities. And then secondly, I came across one that talked about how high intensity or operating in that heavy domain. So up close to, or I guess that would be, up close to functional threshold during a warm-up, what they referred to as priming exercises, what we've referred to as priming exercises, favorably impacted these kinetics. So depending on the type of effort you are about to do in your race or in your workout, working above threshold for a brief period of time can have a favorable impact on it. Another topic that we might cover at a later time. Okay, so to close this out, let's go back to Lucas versus his friend and look at what I consider to be the 4 most likely explanations. First off, and there's a lot of overlap between these things, so it might sound a bit repetitious, but your friend might be predominantly more fast twitch than you are. And this could be a genetic limitation, or just this is how it is, or he simply hasn't developed as robust an aerobic capacity as you have, Lucas. But this is what VO2 max work is about. So keep on doing those workouts together. Could be a fitness mismatch between y'all. So Lucas is generally fitter. Specifically, he's aerobically fitter. He has a bigger aerobic capacity, maybe has bigger VO2 on-off kinetics. Could be that. This is the one that I lean toward, and this kind of describes me too, is that Lucas isn't working hard enough relative to his fitness or his aerobic capacity. Maybe working at 120% isn't a sufficient enough stimulus. And for these short efforts, he has to rise above that in order to elevate his uptake, impose that demand at the muscle such that it creates a sufficient stimulus for adaptation. It just might not be doing enough work. And by the way, these are numerous rationales for adaptive training, because these are the sort of things we sussed out. And then finally, your friend might be overdoing it. He might be exceeding that MED, that minimum effective dose that we've talked about, which lately I've actually I'm moving toward another idea of a maximum recoverable dose. And it sounds like basically the same thing, but it's not. So the minimum effective dose is how little can I do to actually inspire a physiologic change, a performance-related change, whereas the MRD, the maximal recoverable dose, is more, what's the strongest stimulus I can administer that will give me the biggest bang for my buck, but will also allow me to recover before my next meaningful workout. And again, this just points it. We point this back at adaptive training.
ahead.
So that's exactly what we're doing.
Thinking ahead. Next day. So Chad, this is once again, adaptive training obviously is one of the things that it really hits home for. So this is a ton of information on why heart rate does certain things. I now feel like I know why my heart rate jumps up or reacts in certain ways, right? But all of this to say that this doesn't mean that heart rate still operates or somehow operates in isolation of all the other variables that may influence this as well, right?
Nothing does,
so
yeah.
If Lucas had, or his friend, if one of them had a great night's sleep or a poor night's sleep or any of the many variables that could affect it, that could also be a contributing factor to this, right?
Sure. Yeah, why not?
Being fatigued.
Totally.
Yep. That's the thing with me. My heart rate doesn't get as high.
And like heat too. Just before Tulsa Tough, it actually got hot here finally. And it was like 100 degrees. And at Tulsa Tough, it was extremely hot. And my heart rate was through the roof. I felt like I was stuck in second gear in a car, like just redlining, ding, 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 like, but I was giving it everything, but the heart was going like crazy, but that's just what it was. So there's so many things that can affect heart rate in terms of what it's doing to try to move all these levers that Chad just talked about. And there's so many things that can influence its capacity or encourage it to do one thing or another as a result, all the different variables we face. So, and this is the interesting thing that kind of like when it boils down to it, Chad, like you said, keep doing this work. It's easy to get hung up on some things like details, but really in the end, it's about doing more of that work in the specific dose that's needed. So then you can actually get better at it rather than getting focused on a red herring that pulls you aside. I'm super guilty of that. And I bet a lot of people listening to this are too. Like, maybe if I get this data point, it can drive me to somehow get closer. But in the end, it's like, hey, are you doing the work?
Yes. It's never going to be that one little thing ever.
If you like this video, make sure you give us a thumbs up.
If you didn't like this video, you can give it a thumbs down, but let us know what you would have done differently in the comments below.
If you want to see more of these videos, make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel. And if you want to become a faster cyclist, check out TrainerRoad.com.
Do it.